I'm a libertarian. What I'm getting is,
did you vote for Joe Jorgensen or Trump?
Who?
Joe Jorgensen. That was the perfect answer. Thank you.
Welcome to the Libertarian Podcast Review. That intro never gets old. Love that. We are here to review your liberty-leaning podcasts, critique them unnecessarily, and maybe help you find that artistic Liberty Star you just didn't know you needed to hear. Give you a heads up on all the things liberty-related. We will compile and give you the best entertainers, influencers in the liberty movement, your hub for all libertarian podcasts. Today, we go to the Wayback Machine and we find out if Murray Rothbard would have taken on the COVID-19 restrictions and how he would have done so. I'm Tyler Yonke. This is episode 8 of the Libertarian Podcast Review. Hope you enjoyed the last one. It was part 1, I think, with Clint of Liberty Lockdown. I certainly had a good time. Guy was very entertaining. I think we put on a good little show there for you. I just wanted to also say he's been blowing it up. Reminds me, Dave Smith talked about him again on his podcast the other day. Talked about Clint, that is. And so did Pete Quinones. Those two guys, is there anybody, like Pete especially, goes out and has everybody. Dave does this too, though. As long as you're not calling him a Nazi, he will call you out and promote your show by throwing some bone out there to you and referencing you. He doesn't give a shit. He is just here about, he's not all about just Dave and Pete. They're about the movement. They're about the stuff. They're sharing everything. And that's what we're here for as well. I think Clint is as well. And love those guys for what they do on that level. And so the hate that they get for that, when they are willing to promote, they bring these losers on and have debates with them to give them publicity, and then those guys shit on them. That Andy Craig guy, the other loser that was out there, and whatever. Dave, feel free to shit on me if you want. Okay. It's not difficult to guess what Murray Rothbard. Do you know who Murray Rothbard is? Well, he would have been 95 this week. So we're doing a little bit of a Murray Rothbard love-a-fest here, and kind of give you an idea of, well, first of all, he was an economist. He's kind of not a contemporary, but he just died in the 90s. So it's not like he's that old. And I didn't even know really much about him, which I'm kind of ashamed to say in a sense. But, it's kind of the way it is. I came to liberty stuff, at least libertarian stuff, a little bit late, but I should have known about him. I read a lot. I'm very well mixed into a lot of people's different circles. Maybe he's just, I don't know how I didn't know. And I feel a little bad about that. But the fact that I did come to him just recently has been fascinating for me. So he's an economist, brilliant economist, wrote a book, his dissertation. I don't know if it's the War of 18, not the War of 1810, the crash of 1819, maybe it was. And that's still like the seminal book out there. But he delved into philosophy. He delved into all property rights and all these other great issues. And it was a wonderful amount of knowledge that this gentleman put out there. He's kind of the current antithesis in a sense of, not antithesis, but the kind of a similar type of Tom Woods, where Tom Woods is a historian, yet is a brilliant economist. Murray Rothbard, brilliant historian, even though he was a brilliant economist as well. I really do enjoy his writings. So maybe we'll look at some of the books that he had here. We just go over a list of some of the wonderful books that Murray Rothbard had. The America's Great Depression, 1963, wrote about that one. Anatomy of the State, that's the great lead into. Everyone should be checking that out. It's a small, super easy to read book. The Betrayal of the American Right, I enjoyed that one as well. That one is, I think it's kind of his attempt to take on the right as far as be part of them, but then they just didn't, as I said, betrayal in a sense. The war, especially the Vietnam War, really kind of soured him, I think, as to them. The Case Against the Fed, Liberty Forum, Conceived in Liberty, that's kind of his colonial era book about the period of American history. Then a bunch of compilation of writing, Ethics of Liberty, which we're going to talk about today. Egalitarianism as a revolt against nature, and other essays. It's on my nightstand at home. History of Money and Banking in the U.S., Colonial Era to World War II. For a New Liberty. For a New Liberty is a great book. In a sense, it's the follow-on from Anatomy of the State, and you should be all checking that out. That takes on every kind of issue. He also talks there at the end kind of about how do you put this in motion? Not quite the Edward Conkin on that sense of the algorithm, but he does a good one. Irrepressible Rothbard, that's Lowell Rockwell did that. Man, Economy, and State, that's his big treatise on economics and everything else you can imagine. Power Market with that as well. The Progressive Era, that was posthumously done by Patrick Newman, I think, of the Mises Institute, ended up compiling that together. And I just checked that out a few years ago. Really good as far as understanding the incestuous nature of the state and big business in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and how that kind of projects itself in today. What government to money. Anyway, check out all his writings on the Mises Institute website. You get your books there. So it's not difficult to understand or guess, I guess, to how Murray Rothbard what he might say about the COVID-19 restrictions that we've been under for about a year now. Libertarians and those concerned about civil rights would probably say you have your First Amendment rights, and specifically, freedom of assembly. You have a right to make decisions about your own safety and your situation. Some would say my body, my choice. I've said that, and it's funny to see the reactions from the left when you start using that about their masks. The opposition, however, comes back with, but you're infecting others, and we all have a right to our own health and our own safety. I had one opponent online say something like, your freedom only extends to the length of my arm. You don't have a right to swing, though. He said, you don't have a right to swing at my face. Well, yeah, but that's not a good example, because if you're swinging, I don't get a chance to, or the right to just run into you and say that you have then, taken aggressive action against me. You don't get to just move into my house and then claim I might infect you. That's just not the way we do it. You don't get to lock me up simply because you're scared. We can break down the COVID-19 restrictions to basically a few things. Fear and risk. In our current state, COVID-19 is a risky element. It's hard to detect. It's hard to know who has it. Who do we know? However, there are certain groups more susceptible than others. What if we analyze COVID-19 as we do any other risk? I mean, shouldn't that? It's crazy that you're saying, shouldn't we do it as any other risk? Yet, that's the problem. This summer, I was reading Ethics of Liberty, and I came upon Rothbard. I think his solution to this issue, or at least his take on it. Near the end of Ethics of Liberty, he takes on Robert Nozik's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. The point of Nozik's book is basically to argue against anarchy and for a minimal state. So then, here in Ethics of Liberty by Murray Rothbard, Chapter 29, we have Robert Nozik's Immaculate Conception of the State. It starts on page 231 here. It goes through 253. So you're just looking at 20-some pages of reading, and you get a little bit of a argument against Robert Nozik. We're going to do it the easy way, though. We're going, instead of me reading it, we're going to have the Mises Institute read it. Jeff Regenbach.
The grisly annals of the crimes and murders of the state throughout history give one very little confidence in the non-risky nature of its activities. I submit that the risks of state tyranny are far greater than the risks of worrying about one or two unreliable procedures of competing defense agencies. But this is scarcely all. For once it is permitted to proceed beyond defense against an overt act of actual aggression, once one can use force against someone because of his risky activities, the sky is then the limit.
I just break in here and let you know that so a lot of this has to do with defense agencies, and that's how Rothbard's going back at Nozik, who's indicating that you should only have one defense agency, and he has different reasons as to why. But these issues play into it when you talk about COVID. So we're going to talk about that. Just back up a tad bit and head forward.
For once it is permitted to proceed beyond defense against an overt act of actual aggression, once one can use force against someone because of his risky activities, the sky is then the limit, and there is virtually no limit to aggression against the rights of others. Once permit someone's fear of the risky activities of others to lead to coercive action, then any tyranny becomes justified, and Nozik's minimal state quickly becomes the maximal state. I maintain, in fact, that there is no Nozikian stopping point from his ultra-minimal state to the maximal totalitarian state. There is no stopping point to so-called preventive restraint or detention. Surely Nozik's rather grotesque suggestion of compensation in the form of resort detention centers is scarcely sufficient to ward off the specter of totalitarianism. A few examples.
All right, before we get into examples, once again, remember that they're mostly talking about issues of different defense agencies. But the real issue then is because Rothbard's discussing it here, is risk. And how are we assessing this risk, and how are we going to minimize it with the fear? So he says, fear encapsulated in itself, and then you start to do coercive action towards your fear of someone else's risk. How does that behest itself? So let's continue on here with some examples.
Perhaps the largest criminal class today in the United States is teenage black males. The risk of this class committing crime is far greater than any other age, gender, or color group. Why not then lock up all teenage black males until they are old enough for the risk to diminish? And then I suppose we could compensate them by giving them healthful food, clothing, playgrounds, and teaching them a useful trade in the resort detention camp. If not, why not? Example, the most...
All right, before we go on there, before you freak out and you start to say that Rothbard's just some sort of Neanderthal that's saying that all the blacks are criminals, that's not what he's saying. Basically, and there's a great concept with this all here, and how it exactly ties in with COVID in this sense, which is there's a calculable, or at least identifiable group, right, which are black teenage males. That's, at least at the time of the writing, highly subjected to being more, for whatever reason, they're more criminal, which could be they're singled out more by the police, or they actually are a criminal, whatever. There's an identifiable class of that. But not every person in that class is a criminal, but you don't know. So you're going to do like the minority report, the precogs, and try to determine the risk and minimize it, because that's really what you're worried about. You're worried about the risk, and you're worried about your own fear, so therefore you're going to use coercive action. You lock up everybody that's a risk, and then you can subsidize them at some point. So think of maybe the COVID people, COVID as infectious people, as black people in this example. Not all are infected, just like not all blacks are criminals. But you then... it's the Muslim ban, it's the internment of the Japanese during World War II. You are going to satiate your own fear by doing this thing and coercing the other class, rather than maybe just protecting yourself against them, which would probably stop some of the crimes in a sense, more guns, less crime. Let's continue on with the next example.
Important argument for prohibition was the undoubted fact that people commit significantly more crimes, more acts of negligence on the highways, when under the influence of alcohol than when cold sober. So why not prohibit alcohol and thereby reduce risk and fear, perhaps compensating the unfortunate victims of the law by free tax-financed supplies of healthful grape juice? Or the infamous Dr. Arnold Hutschnecker's plan of identifying allegedly future criminals in the grade schools and then locking them away for suitable brainwashing. If not, why not? In each case, I submit that there is only one why not, and this should be no news to libertarians who presumably believe in inalienable individual rights. Namely, that no one has the right to coerce anyone not himself directly engaged in an overt act of aggression against rights. Any loosening of this criterion to include coercion against remote risks is to sanction impermissible aggression against the rights of others. Any loosening of this criterion, furthermore, is a passport to unlimited despotism.
I just want to read that again. So any loosening of this criterion to include this coercion against remote risk is to sanction impermissible aggression against the rights of others. Any loosening of this criterion, furthermore, is a passport to unlimited despotism. That's, one thing Dave Smith has talked about limited government. Everyone's for limited government. Just what's your definition of limited? Pol Pot was one, Mao was one, you've got Bush, Cheney, other definitions, and there's always degrees. So everyone in that sense is still looking to control, but at what point? And that if you look at my episode 1 here, my understanding with Rothbard and kind of what made me decide to be not a minimalist or a minarchist anymore was his understanding that from the lefties, they're basically saying, at what point is your belief, you still want to control something. So at some point, even on a minimal level, you're still looking for something to control from the government. There's still, utilities, maybe the military, maybe this, that. So there we have it. Let's keep going.
Any state founded on these principles has been conceived not immaculately, that is, without interfering with anyone's rights, but by a savage act of rape. Thus, even if risk were measurable, even if Nozik could provide us with a cutoff point of when activities are too risky, His rite of passage from dominant agency to ultra-minimal state would still be aggressive, invasive, and illegitimate. But furthermore, as Childs has pointed out, there is no way to measure the probability of such risk, let alone the fear, both of which are purely subjective. The only risk that can be measured is found in those rare situations, such as a lottery or a roulette wheel, where the individual events are random, strictly homogeneous, and repeated a very large number of times. In almost all cases of actual human action, these conditions do not apply, and so there is no measurable cutoff point of risk.
Okay, so I just want to make a comparison once again with COVID. So even if the risks are measurable, they're saying, well, he's saying they're immeasurable, so you don't know. Well, in our sense, they actually are. I mean, with COVID, we are literally able to calculate the risk, the deaths per 1,000, break those down by age, and what is that happening. And you can see comorbidities. You can see who is more likely to be at risk of this disease than others. So therefore, you can actually, in a sense, in this way, calculate it out even more. So you don't have to say it's everyone, we don't know who in this class. Well, we actually can break that down and say we do know who in this class. So we're actually, our risk assessment of the examples he gave are even able to go beyond that.
This brings us to Williamson Evers' extremely useful concept of the proper assumption of risk. We live in a world of ineluctable and unmeasurable varieties of uncertainty and risk. In a free society, possessing full individual rights, the proper assumption of risk is by each individual over his own person and his justly owned property.
I just want to say, from a legal perspective, assumption of the risk is, as far as negligence goes, that is, in a sense, a defense. So I do a lot of bike riding and had a nice bike wreck this last week. Go on a bike ride out with a bunch of people, kind of racing or doing that kind of thing. You can actually, when that someone gets hurt, someone runs over me, or as far as another cyclist running into me, I don't really have a method of suing him in that sense, because it depends on what the obvious circumstances are, because there is an assumption of the risk. I knew what those risks were going in. A reasonable person, especially someone who's been a cyclist like me since I was 10 years old, it's really something that you understand. Other bikes, you overlap with them. There's going to be cars out there. Traffic, all that kind of stuff. Those are the risks you take. But doesn't mean that another rider could just come up and hit me on the head with a baseball bat, knock me out. That was not a risk that I assumed. So these are risks that are associated with this, and that's what we have here. And likewise, you can't just go walking into someone who's punching and say that they're, that's the risk you're taking. The assumption is that if they're doing a game, in a sense, you don't get to just go into there or drive across the road in the highway of the cars. You're going to be plowed down, and it's not their fault. Anyway, let's kind of go on here.
No one, then, can have the right to coerce anyone else into reducing his risks. Such coercive assumption is aggression and individual over his own person and his justly owned property. No one, then, can have the right to coerce anyone else into reducing his risks. Such coercive
So, unless you're my wife, you can't really tell me not to go out and go on a bike ride, because those are my risks to assume, and not for you to coerce me not to go and do.
Assumption is aggression and invasion to be properly stopped and punished by the legal system. Of course, in a free society, anyone may take steps to reduce risks that do not invade someone else's rights and property. For example, by taking out insurance, hedging operations, performance bonding, etc. But all of this is voluntary, and none involves either taxation or compulsory monopoly. And as Roy Childs states, any coercive intervention in the market's provision for risk shifts the societal provision for risk away from the optimal, and hence increases risk to society. One example of Nozik's sanctioning aggression against property rights is his concern with the private landowner who is surrounded by enemy landholders who won't let him leave. To the libertarian reply that any rational landowner would have first purchased access rights from surrounding owners, Nozik brings up the problem of being surrounded by such a set of numerous enemies that he still would not be able to go anywhere. But the point is that this is not simply a problem of land ownership. Not only in the free society, but even now, suppose that one man is so hated by the whole world that no one will trade with him or allow him on their property. Well then, the only reply is that this is his own proper assumption of risk. Any attempt to break that voluntary boycott by physical coercion is illegitimate aggression against the boycotter's rights.
So you can actually think about this of a business owner in a sense, and how you're going to deal with the provisions. Maybe you're going to keep it a little cleaner, a little safer. Texas now said there's not a mask mandate, but maybe you want in your own business, you want to continue this mandate just for people to come in. Maybe people don't want to go in there because there's that. Well, that's the options. And this is kind of, once again, you can point a lot of this stuff back to COVID and relate it to that with what Rothbard is saying.
This fellow had better find some friends, or at least purchase allies, as quickly as possible. How then does Nozik proceed from his ultra-minimal to his minimal state? He maintains that the ultra-minimal state is morally bound to compensate the prohibited would-be purchasers of the services of independence by supplying them with protective services, and hence the night watchman, or minimal state. In the first place, this decision, too, is a conscious and visible one, and scarcely the process of an invisible hand. But more importantly, Nozik's principle of compensation is in even worse philosophical shape, if that is possible, than his theory of risk. For first, compensation, in the theory of punishment, is simply a method of trying to recompense the victim of crime. It must in no sense be considered a moral sanction for crime itself. Nozik asks whether property rights means that people are permitted to perform invasive actions provided that they compensate the person whose boundary has been crossed. In contrast to Nozik, the answer must be no in every case. As Randy Barnett states in his critique of Nozik, contrary to Nozik's principle of compensation, all violations of rights should be prohibited. That's what right means. And, while voluntarily paying a purchase price makes an exchange permissible, compensation does not make an aggression permissible or justified. Rights must not be transgressed, period. Compensation being simply one method of restitution or punishment after the fact. I must not be permitted to cavalierly invade someone's home and break his furniture simply because I am prepared to compensate him afterward. Secondly, there is no way of knowing in
Stimulus checks.
any case what the compensation is supposed to be. Nozik's theory depends on people's utility scales being constant, measurable, and knowable to outside observers, none of which is the case. Austrian subjective value theory shows us that people's utility scales are always subject to change, and that they can neither be measured nor known to any outside observer. If I buy a newspaper for 15 cents, then all we can say about my value scale is that at the moment of purchase, the newspaper is worth more to me than the 15 cents, and that is all. That evaluation can change tomorrow, and no other part of my utility scale is knowable to others at all. A minor point. Nozik's pretentious use of the indifference curve concept is not even necessary for his case, and it adds still further fallacies. For indifference is never, by definition, exhibited in action, in actual exchanges, and is therefore unknowable and objectively meaningless.
All right, so I think the rest of it you can kind of check out for yourself. Like I said, 20 pages. It's some of the meat in there, which is the assumption of the risk, the fear in the risk, and how that plays into it, and how, if you even have a minimalist state, there is going to be a deluge of your rights being overdone just by trying to minimize this risk in any which way possible. I think Rothbard in Ethics of Liberty, chapter 29, does a great job of breaking down the Nozik issue, fallacies in a sense, and also kind of your defense for this going forward, which is, look, I think Clint did a great job when I talked about his show on episode 2 when he talked to someone else, which is how, and it basically comes from the Rothbard ideas, which is there's your property rights. Where do those rights come from? First of all, if you think that your rights come from government, then if the government's granting them to you, then the government can take them away. It starts with property rights, and it starts with your individual personal right of self-ownership. If someone else partially owns you, then they have the ability to control you. No one owns you but yourself. Once you have that established, now you can go on from there. You know, the government makes a lot of rulings on your rights as far as your First Amendment rights, and their standard of review, or how they're going to take that in, whether it's, does the government have any kind of impermissible I'm losing my constitutional thoughts here, but basically, is there any kind of thing that they have an ability to overwrite, and that they have a duty to protect in that, or is that all on you? And it's kind of the way that it's weighted on those, and your First Amendment rights are institutionalized, and they should be, but it's just a piece of paper, and how it's, the rulings of the court sometimes make that different as far as, we're seeing that right now. You shall not be infringed on your First Amendment, your Second Amendment rights for your guns, but yet they're infringed all the time. Anyway, we think back at those, and then your assumption of the risk, and that your ability to go out, and your ability to do whatever, and we are just being overrun. The last thing I said, I'll close out here, when I talked to Clint the other day on his show, which was, we were talking about foreign policy, and we'll get back into that with his debate when he decides to come back on the show, which is we are having a hard time of spreading democracy here in the U.S. right now under COVID. It's just impossible. And yet people still think that, like this neocon, that we could go and spread it in foreign countries. I don't understand, that's not possible. But right here, why is it slipping away from us so easily, and it should not be? So anyway, check out Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty. Very good book for every kind of issue you would really want to think about there. And especially at chapter 29, where he takes on Nozik. If you're thinking of reading Nozik, maybe all you need to do is read chapter 29, Ethics of Liberty. Thanks, everyone. Libertarian Podcast Review. Till next time. What show are we going to do? I don't know. I was thinking of Status Quo, Matt. From there, maybe some others. Send us your favorites, what you want reviewed. Thanks, everybody.